Bem, boa tarde, amigos. Vamos para mais uma sessão aqui do 5º Congresso do Centro Internacional Celso Furtado. Nós temos uma enorme satisfação, eu, pessoalmente, de ter aqui o professor Deepak Nayyar. O professor Deepak Nayyar, ele é amigo do Centro, ele já esteve em 2 edições de congressos internacionais do Centro, em 2012 e 2014. Eu vou ler uma breve... Se eu tivesse que ler toda a biografia do professor Deepak, eu tomava possivelmente o tempo dele. Então, eu vou ler uma breve resumo da uma biografia dele. O professor Deepak, ele é chair do Board of Trustees do Institute of Development Studies, IDS. Ele é também um professor emérito de economia da Jawaharlal Nehru University de Nova Delhi, e é um honorary fellow do Balliol College de Oxford. Ele foi o Distinguished University Professor da New School for Social Research de Nova York, de 2008 a 2012. Ele ensinou na University of Oxford, na Universidade de Sussex, e no Indian Institute of Management de Calcutá. E ele também foi o reitor da Universidade de Delhi de 2000 a 2005. O professor estava conferindo com ele que eu não queria fazer nenhuma injustiça. O professor Deepak tem 21 livros editados, inclusive a gente estava falando, ele tem inclusive de fotografias, para quem quiser ver isso na Amazon. Ele tem um livro que foi publicado pelo Centro Celso Furtado. A gente tem essa honra de ter publicado um livro do professor Deepak, que é A Corrida do Crescimento, um livro que eu recomendo para todos, inclusive quem estiver aí na coisa, pode até adquirir o seu próprio livro. E ele publicou recentemente um livro chamado Resurgent Asia, Diversity in Development. Esse livro pode ser downloadado de forma gratuita, tá? Então, o professor Deepak, vocês podem obter esse livro, segundo ele, já tem mais de 100 mil downloads. Então, eu acho que o que ele vai usar esse texto como base da apresentação hoje, que é Asia's Remarkable Economic Transformation. E sem mais delongas, porque não queremos tomar o tempo do professor Deepak, eu apresento ele e convido ele. Professor Deepak, it's a pleasure and an honor to have you here with us. Please.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for those warm words of welcome. It is a privilege for me to be in your midst again at a Celso Furtado Congress. I was there at the first one in 2012 and the second one in 2014. So it feels good to be back, even in this hybrid online world. This lecture, based on my recent book, Resurgent Asia, analyzes the phenomenal transformation of Asia, which would have been difficult to imagine, let alone predict 50 years ago, when Myrdal published Asian Drama. In doing so, it provides an analytical narrative of this remarkable story of economic development, situated in its wider context of historical, political, and social factors, and an economic analysis of the underlying factors, with a focus on critical issues in the process of and outcomes in development. Given the size and the diversity of the Asian continent, the aggregate level is obviously not always appropriate. Thus, the study disaggregates Asia, excluding Japan, into 4 constituent subregions: East, Southeast, South, and West Asia, and further into 14 selected countries that I describe as the Asian 14: China, India, South Korea, Indonesia, Turkey, Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Sri Lanka. These countries, listed in descending order of GDP at current prices and market exchange rates, account for more than 4/5 of the population and the income of Asia. At the outset, it is necessary to recognize the diversity of Asia. There were marked differences between countries in geographical size, embedded histories, colonial legacies, nationalist movements, initial conditions, natural resource endowments, population size, income levels, and political systems. The reliance on markets and the degree of openness in economies varied greatly across space and over time. The politics, too, ranged widely from socialism through state capitalism to capitalism, from authoritarian regimes through oligarchies to political democracies, and from one party states to multi party systems. Outcomes in development, which differed not only between countries at any point in time, but also within countries over time, were diverse. There were different paths to development because there were no universal solutions, there were no magic wands. Hence, there were choices to be made which were shaped by a complex mix of economic, social, and political factors in the national context where history mattered. Yet, despite such diversity, there are discernible patterns pointing to substantive analytical lessons that emerge from the Asian development experience. The scope of the book is indeed vast. Given the time constraint, I can only outline the broad contours of the analysis to focus on important findings and conclusions. I hope that this would serve as a teaser to stimulate thinking on an exciting yet relatively unexplored subject and tempt you to read the book. Next slide. Could I have the next slide, please? Well, this slide is in part, the overview is in part a roadmap of the book and also mirrors the structure of the lecture. This book was published by Oxford University Press, Oxford, in late 2019. It is an open access book. Anyone interested can download it from the OUP website and do so for free. The book is also going to be published in paperback edition later this year, I think in late October. Okay, next slide. Well, next slide, please. Historical perspective and initial conditions. In 1820, 2 centuries ago, Asia accounted for 2/3 of world population and almost 3/5 of world income, where just two countries, China and India, accounted for 1/2 of world population and world income. Next slide, please, and we'll come back to this one. Yeah. Now, the colonial era, you will see from this figure, witnessed a precipitous decline in this economic significance, both in Asia's share of world population and in Asia's share of world income. By 1962, the share of Asia in world population diminished to 50%, while its share of world income plummeted to 15% from the 50% that it was. For China and India taken together, these shares plunged to 35% and 8% respectively. The outcome was what has been described as the Great Divergence. Next slide, please. Sorry, there's something. Go back. Okay, you had. I think one slide is missing. Go back. Go further, please. Okay. Next slide. And the one after that? No. There is a slide is missing. I'm sorry. But let me, I don't know what happened to that. Income per capita in Asia as a proportion of that in the West dropped from 1/2 in 1820 to less than 1/10 in 1962. You don't need a figure to demonstrate that. This was associated with the great specialization, which meant that Western Europe, we can go back to the earlier slide one, please. I'm still on that. Yeah, and further back. Yeah. This was associated with the great specialization, which meant that Western Europe produced manufactured goods while Asia produced primary commodities. Consequently, the share of China and India in world manufacturing production collapsed from 47% in 1830 to 5% in 1963. The decline and fall of Asia was attributable to its integration with the world economy through trade and investment shaped by colonialism and driven by imperialism. The industrialization of Western Europe and the deindustrialization of Asia were, in fact, two sides of the same coin, which had a devastating impact on China and India, what I described as the decline and fall of Asia. It is no surprise that circa 1970, 50 years ago, in terms of income levels, Asia was the poorest continent in the world, poorer than Africa. Its demographic and social indicators of development, among the worst anywhere, epitomized its underdevelopment. Such initial conditions, inherited from the past, were the starting point in its journey to development. Even so, unlike Latin America and Africa, most Asian countries did have a long history of well structured states and cultures which were not entirely destroyed by colonialism. And governments came into being with relative ease. In pursuit of development, the reshaping of initial conditions was particularly important in the early post colonial era. For one, governments invested in developing a physical infrastructure for energy, transport, and communication. For another, governments sought to spread education in society, where primary education provided the base and higher education provided the edge. Governments also sought to facilitate institutional change, land reform, planning offices, industrial boards, financial institutions, development banks that would be conducive to development. Now, in each of these domains, a critical minimum was necessary to kickstart the process of development. Uh, Next slide, please. And the one after that, the rise of Asia. Okay. Now, the transformation of Asia over the past 50 years reflected in its demographic transition, social progress, and economic development has been phenomenal. Okay. Can we move to the next slide, the figure, please? Okay. Its share of world GDP. Now, this is Asia's share of world population and world GDP on the left-hand side. It rose from 10% to 30% between 1970 and 2016, while its income per capita surpassed that of developing countries and converged towards the world average income level. Although convergence was at best modest compared with industrialized countries because the initial income gap was so enormous. Next, please. Okay. Growth in this figure shows you growth rates of GDP and GDP per capita in Asia compared with country groups in the world economy. Okay. Now, growth in GDP and GDP per capita in Asia was much higher than in the world economy, in industrialized countries, and in the developing world, both Africa and Latin America, as you can see clearly from this chart. Over this period, the share of Asia in world industrial production and world manufactured exports jumped from a minuscule 4% to more than 40%. It multiplied by 10. Its share of world merchandise trade rose from about 1/12 to 1/3. It multiplied by 4. Its engagement with the world economy through international investment as a destination and a source witnessed similar change. Now, this provides a sharp contrast with the decline and fall of Asia in the world economy, during the colonial era from 1820 to 1960. For Asian countries, political independence, which restored their economic autonomy and enabled them to pursue their national development objectives, made this possible. However, economic and social development was most unequal between the constituent subregions of Asia. East Asia was the leader, and South Asia were the laggard, where China and India are respectively located, with Southeast Asia in the middle, while progress in West Asia did not match its high income levels to begin with. Economic growth was faster than elsewhere in the world, not only in East Asia, but also in South Asia and Southeast Asia through much of this period. Yet, East Asia contributed about two-thirds of the increase in Asia's share of world GDP, while West Asia, South Asia, and West Asia together contributed the remaining one-third. Industrialization was even more concentrated in East Asia, which accounted for more than three-fourths of the increase in Asia's share of world manufacturing value added. And it was East Asia that witnessed a significant convergence in incomes per capita. Let's move to the next slide, please. Okay, now this is I forgot this one. The share of industrialized countries, developing countries in Asia in world manufacturing value added and in world manufactured exports. So that you see that Asia contributes much of manufacturing value added in the developing world and much of manufactured exports from the developing world. Next. Let me now turn to the macroeconomics of growth. Economic growth over 50 years in most of the Asian 14 has been stunning. China was the star performer throughout. Growth rates of both GDP and GDP per capita were high in South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand during 1971-1990, but slowed down significantly during 1991-2016, whereas these growth rates were lower in India, Vietnam, and Bangladesh during 1971-90, but were much higher during 91-2016. In comparison, the growth performance of Sri Lanka was respectable, although it is down and out at this moment, while that of Turkey was average, but that of Philippines and Pakistan was poor. The slowdown in growth during 91-2016 experienced by South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, I believe was attributable to the long-term effects of the Asian financial crisis. In countries where growth was impressive, investment and savings rose rapidly, driving growth on the supply side. Thus, trends in savings rates and investment rates mirrored differences in growth performance across countries over time. Education, which contributed to human capital formation, was a sustained driver of growth in countries that were success stories. An analysis of long-term changes in the composition of aggregate demand shows that from the demand side, growth was primarily private consumption expenditure-led and investment-led. In most of the Asian 14, it was government consumption expenditure-led only in Indonesia. The contribution of net exports as a demand stimulus to growth was in general, surprisingly, small or negative, except in Singapore and to some extent in China, South Korea, and Taiwan, but only for limited periods. The interaction between the supply side and the demand side in the Asian 14 suggests that there was a nexus between investment and exports at a macro level, which could drive economic growth, creating a virtuous circle of cumulative causation. Investment created a domestic market on the demand side and transformed the industrial structure on the supply side, whereas exports provided an external market on the demand side and enforced a cost discipline on the supply side. Thus, I argue, where rapid investment growth coincided in time with rapid export growth, there was rapid GDP growth. This was so in China throughout, in South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand during 1971-1990, and in India, Vietnam, and Bangladesh during 91-2016. But this did not happen in countries where rapid investment growth and rapid export growth did not coincide, or where growth in both was slow. Now, it is clear to me that many of the Asian 14 did not follow orthodox prescriptions of balanced budgets and price stability for macroeconomic management. In fact, they were heterodox in their objectives and policies. Their primary macroeconomic objectives were economic growth and employment creation. Their macroeconomic policies were also broader and more versatile in their use of policy instruments. For example, public investment or tax concessions in the fiscal sphere and interest rates in the monetary sphere were used to stimulate private investment. Their success in maintaining high growth rates increased their degrees of freedom, which enabled them to finance government deficits and raise sustainable levels of government borrowing, while making higher inflation rates politically more acceptable, none of which would have been possible if economic growth was slow. Next, let me turn to structural change and economic transformation. Development in Asia has been associated with the structural transformation of economies over 5 decades. In this process, economic growth drove structural change from the demand side as incomes rose and production activities followed. In the same manner that Alan Fisher and Colin Clark set it out. While structural change drove economic growth from the supply side, as labor moved from low productivity to higher productivity activities, a la Schumpeter, Kuznets, Chenery. There were significant differences between the Asian 14 in their paths to structural transformation. South Korea and Taiwan, followed by China, Malaysia, and possibly Indonesia later, conformed to the classical pattern of structural change from agriculture through manufacturing or industry to services. Singapore, a country without a rural hinterland, moved from manufacturing to services. In contrast, India, Turkey, Thailand, Philippines, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, followed by Bangladesh and Vietnam later, did not conform to this traditional sequence. The transition from a situation where the agricultural sector was dominant to a situation where the services sector was dominant was far from uniform in the Asian 14. Yet, there was an exit of labor from agriculture everywhere. In some countries, into manufacturing. In other countries, to industry outside manufacturing, particularly construction, but also mining. In yet other countries, to services. And these three sorts of labor transfers overlapped in time and space. In the earlier stages of development, such labor transfers between sectors was growth promoting. In the later stages of development, productivity increase within sectors was growth promoting. The relative importance of these two drivers differed across countries as well as sectors and changed over time. Yet, the services sector progressively became the largest employer with the highest output share across the Asian 14. It is clear that apart from South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and perhaps Malaysia, the process of structural transformation in the Asian 14 is uneven and incomplete, as the share of agriculture in employment remains far greater than its share in output. This is alarmingly the case in India, but China is not very different. The transformation of the agricultural sector remains incomplete in China, and even more so in Southeast Asia, while South Asia has the maximum distance to traverse. There is much less progress in manufacturing from industrialization, particularly in South Asia, while industrial dynamism has waned in Southeast Asia. The services sector has led economic growth so far in several countries, largely through the absorption of unskilled labor, But I think this will not be sustainable because, unlike manufacturing, it's not possible for workers to move from low productivity sectors to higher productivity sectors, such as retail, trade, such as the transport sector, into higher productivity sectors such as financial services, business services, telecom services, because the latter have barriers to entry. Now, in many of the Asian 14, it is necessary to address the neglect of agriculture and renew the emphasis on manufacturing, just as it is essential to exploit the synergies and complementarities between manufacturing and services. The policy lesson is clear. Economic growth cannot be sustained and structural transformation cannot be completed if even if one of the three sectors is a weak link in the chain. Okay. Now, let me move to what is the heart of the book in terms of debates about development. Openness and industrialization. Can you move to the next slide, please? And the role of governments and markets, the respective roles. Now, on both these issues, views about Asia are polar opposites, okay? And I'm going to outline for you my view, which is neither of the polar opposites. It is a more nuanced view. Now, the past 50 years have witnessed a marked increase in the degree of economic openness in Asia, reflected in international trade and investment flows. Between 1970 and 2008, for Asia, merchandise trade as a proportion of GDP rose from less than 10% to about 40%. Although, following the global economic crisis in 2008, it contracted to 25% in 2016. Similarly, during 1970-2016, the stock of inward and outward foreign direct investment as a proportion of GDP increased from 15% to 30%, that is inward, and from 1% to 20% outward as a proportion of GDP, respectively. The Asian 14 mirrored these trends. There were, of course, differences between countries depending upon their size and openness. The pace of industrialization was impressive. For Asia and the Asian 14, the share of manufacturing in GDP rose from 10% in 1970 to 25% in 2016. Economic openness has performed a critical supportive, I stress the word supportive, role in the process, wherever it has been in the form of strategic integration with rather than passive insertion into the world economy. However, analysis of the industrialization experience in the Asian 14 shows that openness, while necessary, was not sufficient. It was conducive to industrialization only when combined with industrial policy. Now, it is worth citing some examples, although practices varied across countries and changed over time. Trade policy was characterized by an asymmetry, as it was open for the export sector but restrictive for other sectors, while exchange rates were undervalued for long periods to support the entry of domestic manufactured goods into world markets, insofar as price can substitute for quality until you become competitive. Regimes for foreign direct investment or foreign technology were calibrated to facilitate industrialization, often using strategic bargaining with large international firms. Singapore is the classic example because Korea and Taiwan relied much more on domestic firms. They imported technology. Singapore, the government owns all the land in Singapore, and land was its bargaining power. China has followed in Singapore's footsteps because Deng Xiaoping's first lessons for change in 1978 came from Lee Kuan Yew, and China had much more to bargain with in terms of cheap labor, in terms of outlaw trade unions, in terms of an infrastructure, and so on. Now, the allocation of investment to selected sectors was influenced by the strategic use of differential interest rates or tax concessions. Okay, that's the example of the Republic of Korea and Taiwan, respectively. Industrial finance was provided through development banks. India was a pioneer and a success story then. Most important, perhaps, there was a coordination of such economic policies across sectors and over time. The pioneering success stories, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, are classic examples of the use of industrial policy through government intervention to realize scale economies, foster vertical diversification, encourage technological upgrading, and develop global brands. The most recent success story, China, has used industrial policy in a very different context in learning to industrialize and then building domestic capabilities in pursuit of long term objectives. Vietnam is attempting to follow in the footsteps of China, although it's never willing to admit that. The industrial dynamism of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand waned after the Asian financial crisis, which could have been sustained if industrial policy had been more purposive and more effective. India, the most industrialized to start with, lagged behind the leaders. In 1970, it was the most industrialized country in Asia. Yeah? It is now way behind China and behind South Korea. It ranks third. Uh, it lagged behind the leaders because industrial policy was poorly implemented or was simply not used. But its success in pharmaceuticals, automobiles, and software is attributable to industrial policy. Bangladesh, too, has used industrial policy to drive its garments export led industrialization. Clearly, success at industrialization in Asia was driven by sensible industrial policy that was implemented by effective governments. In future, however, technological learning and technological capabilities are also essential to provide the foundations for sustaining industrialization. Let me now turn to the other contentious issue on the debates about development everywhere, but particularly in the context of Asia. And that is about markets, governments, and politics. Okay? Uh, Governments performed a critical role, ranging from leader to catalyst or supporter, in the economic transformation of Asia spanning half a century. While their willingness and ability to do so depended on the nature of the state, which in turn was shaped by politics. The state and the market are complements, I believe, rather than substitutes. And the two institutions must adapt to each other in an interactive, cooperative manner over time. Success at development in Asia was about managing this evolving relationship between states and markets by finding the right balance in their respective roles, which also changed over time. Countries where governments did not or could not perform this role and were unable to evolve their role vis a vis markets lagged behind in development. The Asian experience suggests that efficient markets and effective governments in tandem provide the way forward to development. The developmental states in South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, okay, for whom Japan was the role model, which could coordinate policies across sectors over time in pursuit of national development objectives, using carrot and stick to implement their agenda, led the economic transformation of these countries, enabling them to become industrialized nations in just 50 years. However, the nature of these states was an outcome of circumstances in history and conjuncture that were very specific to them. I'd be happy to return to that during discussion if people wish to. China emulated these developmental states in an altogether different political context and with much success. just as Vietnam has followed 2 decades later on the same transition path, because both countries had strong one-party communist governments with clear objectives that could coordinate and implement policies. I believe it is not possible to replicate these developmental states elsewhere in Asia. Even so, other countries in the Asian 14, where states were less effective in implementing their agenda, governments did manage to improve or to introduce economic policies and evolve in institutional arrangements that were conducive to industrialization and development. And very often they were in terms of political settlements, in terms of sharing of rents, in terms of the political class entering into arrangements with the industrial class. Now, in countries that do not have developmental states, other than China, Vietnam, and the original Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, it is not. It is only institutionalized checks and balances that can make governments more development-oriented and people-friendly. And this is where I come to my view, which is often questioned by many. This is obviously more feasible, I argue, in political democracies than in authoritarian regimes. Of course, democracies in Asia do have their flaws and warts. These might seem larger than life, and democracies evolve slowly. Over time, however, they are less fragile and more robust than authoritarian regimes. For Asia's continuing journey in development, I argue, during the 21st century, democracy is better than the alternatives, not only for the rights and freedoms it provides for citizens, but also for the checks and balances and the self-correcting mechanisms it provides for political systems when things go wrong. Okay? Let me now turn to an important part of the story. Asia is a success story, but outcomes in development have been most unequal for countries and for people. Rapid economic growth in Asia was associated with an unequal distribution of its benefits among countries and between people. Compared with industrialized countries, the convergence of per capita incomes was rapid in South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, significant in China and Malaysia, somewhat less in Thailand and Sri Lanka, but negligible elsewhere. The experience of the Asian 14 does not validate the convergence hypothesis, as there was no consistent relationship between the initial level of per capita income and its subsequent rate of growth. There was, in fact, a widening gap in per capita income levels within the Asian 14, while the gap between the richest and the poorest countries in Asia was awesome at more than 100:1. Yet, there was also a significant increase in inequality between people within countries, except in South Korea and Taiwan. The principal explanation for which lies in the land reform that was implemented by General MacArthur and US occupation forces in both countries. Just as there has been a marked increase in inequality between regions within countries, both of which were more pronounced in countries that experienced rapid growth. The benefits accrued largely to people and regions that were already well endowed. Even so, rapid growth did lead to a substantial reduction in absolute poverty. The irony is, the scale of absolute poverty that persists despite unprecedented growth in Asia is just as striking as the sharp reduction therein. The poverty reduction, I am convinced, could have been much greater were it not for the rising inequality. In the Asian 14, rising per capita incomes and improving social indicators such as life expectancy and literacy rates were related, and the causation ran in both directions. However, the well-being of people is crucial, I argue. Why? Because it is both constitutive of and instrumental in development. Okay. In other words, well-being of people is the essence of development. At the same time, the well-being of people drives development. The constitutive and the instrumental could complement each other through positive feedback mechanisms. Thus, social progress for people and economic development for countries together, which dispensed with the need to mediate between economic growth and social development, can and did reinforce each other in a virtuous circle. Conversely, unequal opportunities and unequal outcomes together can also accentuate each other over time, making matters worse both for the well-being of people and the development of nations. Okay. Now, I turn next to Asian development and the world economy. For those interested, there is a fascinating chapter in the book. Given the time I have, I will be brief, highlighting just what I believe are the essentials. During the post-colonial era, the relationship between Asia and the world was shaped by geopolitics, in which economics and politics, juxtaposed with history and geography, were closely intertwined. East and Southeast Asia became the main arena for contesting political ideologies, capitalism versus communism in the Cold War, while West Asia was the stage where strategic interests driven by oil played out. Both were associated with conflicts and wars that shaped trajectories of development. Okay, some of you might recall the coup against Mossadegh in Iran by the oil companies. Now, the irony is that the frontline states in the Cold War era, Korea and Taiwan on the one hand, China and Vietnam on the other, on either side of the ideological divide, turned out to be success stories. It is not surprising because the vulnerability created a motivation, an aspiration, and that is visible in all these countries that were caught in the Cold War. Now, three specific aspects of Asia's emerging engagement with the world economy with implications for development deserve mention. More than one half of Asia's merchandise trade is within developing Asia. Its relative importance has increased over time. And while China was at the apex of this formation until 1995, China has replaced Japan as the hub for intra-Asia trade after 1995. The international, there is also an internationalization of Asian firms concentrated in China, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, India, and Malaysia. It is actually based on the acquisition of capabilities over a much longer period of time while learning to industrialize. However, capital account liberalization and premature integration into international financial markets has done much more harm than good, with negative consequences for development, particularly in South Asia, but also to some extent in East Asia, because these countries have not recovered their trajectories of development after the Asian financial crisis. Okay? Now, the international economic and political architecture for global governance was created around 1945. Asia had no voice in that process. Now, the shifting balance of power, Asia is 30% of world GDP, Asia is 40% of world manufacturing, Asia is 35% of world trade. Now, the shifting balance of power provides Asia with an opportunity to influence the reform of existing institutions and the creation of missing institutions. However, coordination and cooperation among Asian countries to exercise collective influence has not surfaced yet, possibly because their relationship is characterized by rivalry. economic and political, rather than unity. Now, I am convinced, and I have argued in this book, or also in my earlier work, that this influence that Asia can exercise, the potential will turn into the real if and only if China and India set aside their rivalries and learn to work together. Now, at the same time, as Asia has kind of performed this miracle, economic problems confronting the world have led to a political backlash in the form of resurgent nationalisms across countries, creating an international milieu very different from the preceding quarter century when the economic transformation of Asia gathered momentum. There is an irony in this situation. The political backlash in the West, in the perceptions of people excluded from prosperity, Brexit, for example, might be partly attributable to the rise of Asia in the world economy or the rise of Donald Trump in the United States. The political backlash in Asia might be partly attributable to the rising inequalities within and between Asian countries. The uncertain future, therefore, is a challenge. I now turn to the concluding part of my lecture, which is also the concluding chapter of the book. As I contemplate the future, is it then possible, you might ask, to speculate or hypothesize about prospects of Asia in the world economy over the next 25 years? The past is relevant, and so is the present. Yet, growth scenarios for the future are based on assumptions about growth rates, even if adjusted over time, simply extrapolate on the past. Of course, the future is not just about linear extrapolations, and growth is not simply about the arithmetic of compound growth rates, as the Goldman Sachs study used them on the BRICS. Indeed, growth is about much more than economics. Such projections can only suggest broad orders of magnitude. But let me give you a flavor of these. Long-term macroeconomic forecasts of GDP at market exchange rates suggest that the top 10 economies in the world in 2050, in descending order, would be China, United States, India, Indonesia, Japan, Germany, Brazil, Mexico, Britain, and France. Now, the same forecasts, there are many, estimate that by 2050, GDP at market exchange rates for each of the top three, China, United States, and India, will be larger than that of the next five, Indonesia, Germany, Japan, Brazil. Many people say Britain, but I would say Mexico put together. Of course, GDP per capita in Western countries will remain far higher than in the Asian or Latin American countries. There are long-term projections by the OECD of GDP in constant 2010 PPP US dollars for major countries. I worry about the use of PPP for such international comparisons because it is really meant to compare living conditions at micro level. Even so, we find that the share of Asia, excluding Japan, in world GDP will be 50% in 2030, 53% in 2040, and 55% in 2050. This is obviously higher than it would be at market exchange rates. This suggests that the share of Asia, excluding Japan, in world GDP in 2050 will return to its level in 1820, when it was 56%. So life would have come full circle for Asia in the world economy in this 2 centuries and more, 1820 to 2050. Now, it might be instructive to extend such comparisons of the future with the past to per capita income levels in Asia. And I have done a simple but robust exercise on this. And I show, for those interested, you can look at the book. In 2030, per capita income in Asia relative to the world will return to its level in 1820. By 2040, Asian per capita income would be the same as world per capita income, returning to the situation circa 1750. Now, the economic determinants of potential growth suggest that several countries in Asia may be able to sustain high rates of economic growth for the next 25 years, perhaps longer, for the following reasons. First, their large population size is expected to increase further, which makes labor a source of growth, but only if that labor is absorbed in employment, and their income levels are low, which means that the possibilities of growth are greater. Their demographic characteristics, in particular, the high proportion of young people in the population, which would mean an increase in their workforce and their savings rates for some time to come, are conducive to growth, provided these countries can harness the demographic dividend through education that creates capabilities amongst people. Their wages are significantly lower than in the world outside, which is an important source of competitiveness for some time to come. Their social infrastructure for education and healthcare, as well as their physical infrastructure, remain less than developed despite the progress so far, so that further improvements are bound to reinforce the momentum of growth. However, these sources of economic growth will not be available for countries that have led the transformation of Asia, particularly South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. China, I believe, will reach that stage soon. The potential for growth in terms of these factors I mentioned on the supply side will be greater in South Asia than in Southeast Asia or West Asia. Among the Asian 14, I would say India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Bangladesh could realize this potential. Turkey, at a much later stage in the demographic transition, could, for it is better endowed in terms of social indicators and human resource development. Malaysia and Thailand need to revive their economic dynamism that has not recovered after the Asian financial crisis. Okay, these opportunities are, however, juxtaposed with formidable challenges. Okay, the obvious one that most of you read about is the middle income trap. It describes a situation where a country makes a transition from low income to middle income status, but gets stuck there, unable to move from middle income to high income status. The first stage in this transition is driven by abundant cheap labor and high investment rates. Growth slows down as these factors wane in their impact, and industrialization stops at labor intensive goods as wages rise. In a sense, that is happening to Southeast Asia. The second stage in the transition requires nurturing managerial and technological capabilities, um, fostering vertical diversification in production processes, which China has done, encouraging technological upgrading, inducing technological learning, and creating R&D capacities. Now, the attainment of these long-term objectives depends on the quality of industrial policy and the quality of human resources. And that is what will shape outcomes in the future. But apart from middle income trap, the most important challenge, perhaps, is the combination of persistent poverty, rising inequality, and jobless growth. Of course, absolute poverty in Asia might be minimal by 2030, but the problems of rising economic inequality and inadequate employment opportunities, unless addressed, will mount. This challenge is not simply economic, it is also social and political. And ultimately, economic growth can be sustained if it eradicates poverty, reduces inequality, and creates employment. Such inclusive growth is the only sustainable way forward, I argue, for Asian countries that lag behind the leaders, because this is what would enable them to mobilize their most abundant resource, people, for the purpose of development, and reinforce the process of growth through cumulative causation. Let me end with a broad historical sweep. The rise of Asia represents the beginning of a shift in the balance of economic power in the world and a discernible erosion in the political hegemony of the West. History reveals that dominant powers are reluctant to cede economic or political space to rising powers that are latecomers. The best example I can think of is the failure to accommodate Germany and Japan, both latecomers to industrialization and empire, which led to two world wars. Thus, such processes of change are always slow. Their duration and outcome are unpredictable. The future will be shaped partly by how Asia exploits the opportunities and meets the challenges, and partly by how the difficult economic and political conjuncture in the world unfolds. Yet, it is plausible to suggest that circa 2050, a century after the end of colonial rule, Asia will account for more than half of world income and will be home to more than half the people on Earth. It will thus have an economic and political significance in the world that would have been difficult to imagine 50 years ago, even if it was a reality in 1820. In terms of income per capita, however, it will be nowhere near as rich as either the United States or Europe. For even when China becomes a high income country in terms of the World Bank classification, possibly next year or the year after, at 12,500 US dollars, it compares with $72,000 in the United States and an average of $50,000 in the in European countries or in industrialized countries. Thus, Asian countries, I believe, will emerge as world powers without the income levels of rich countries. China will be large and influential, and so might India. But as a continent, Asia will not have the dominance that Britain had in the 19th century or the United States has had in the 20th century and has perhaps even now, although we can see the beginning of its decline in the withdrawal syndrome. The idea of an Asian century, in my view, is hyperbole. The most likely scenario in 2050 is a multipolar world in which dominance is not likely to be so striking. The United States and China will probably be the leading countries with an economic and political significance in this world, but it is likely that this group will be larger. It will include India, Indonesia, and Japan from Asia. It will certainly include Brazil and Mexico from Latin America, and it will include Germany and France, and possibly Britain if it's not on self-destruct from Europe. The presence of what are now developing countries in this group will depend in large part on whether they can transform themselves into inclusive societies where economic growth, human development, and social progress move in tandem. Even in such a multipolar world, a shift in the balance of power towards Asia is inevitable, and the past of Asia could be a pointer to its future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Deepak. It was not just a great presentation, but a great teaser. I think a lot of people run to download your book right now. I was like trying to download, but I will do it later, of course, and I will read.
Everybody can download it.
Yes, can download it. It's OUP, Oxford University Press.
OUP Oxford, yes. I think it is the first book, what they call trade books, which reach out to a wider audience that they went to open access with. They asked me, and I was delighted. I said that if, nothing that authors love more than readers, and if I want to earn income from royalties, I should be writing pulp fiction. But they haven't yet made catch up open access. They still continue to sell it.
Great. So everybody just run to download the Professor Deepak Nayyar book, because his teaser shows that it has a lot of stuff that we should read, and very interesting. I'm not sure, because I don't know if there are questions. Claudio, is there any question here? So I have questions, so I will ask. Oh, boa tarde, excellent presentation. Gonzalo, I will read the question because it's important. Professor Nayyar could explain a little bit the model of Bangladesh. What are the main growth drivers to you? The second is the question I would ask. So just save my work.
Okay. So shall I do it one at a time?
No, this two, they're connected. Is the cooperation of India and China? It's possible, of course. There are those border conflicts, and you mentioned in the presentation they have to put aside their rivalries. So it's a very important topic. And he adds, Manolo, our friend, adds that what would be the role of the U.S. in this rivalry? Because of course the U.S. are interested in, I should say, put one against the other. So it's important, the role of the U.S. in this rivalry, that should be put aside. Is there any other, Claudio? No. So So you can answer these two interesting questions by Manolo.
Okay, let me address both of those, and I will do so briefly, and then I'd be happy to answer the question that you have in mind, Carlos. I think the success story of Bangladesh is fascinating because it has multiple dimensions. On the one hand, there is, it is the economy in Asia in which the government has perhaps played a less significant role than civil society. So that microcredit, which was done largely by non-government organizations, has done wonders for increasing female participation rates in rural Bangladesh, just as it has done wonders for yields in agriculture. So one part of the story is rural Bangladesh, which is driven almost entirely by civil society and microcredit. The Grameen Bank, for example, Muhammad Yunus, he got the Nobel Prize for that. If you want to look at the story of industrialization, it's also fascinating. It is actually about the use of industrial policy. Bangladesh recognized that, it had a comparative advantage in garments. Its wages were low. Wage costs per unit of output were even lower because productivity was decent. And, given the old world where there were this international trade in textiles was governed by MFA, you had lots of Indian firms manufacturing and entrepreneurs manufacturing in Bangladesh to export garments. Okay. Now, Bangladesh and Vietnam are the two success stories. Vietnam has come much more from the global value chains end, large international firms, subcontracting. But Bangladesh has come from domestic industrial policy. They actually, because they were very small-scale garment exporters, they actually persuaded Daewoo, which was a large Korean international firm, mostly in automobiles at that time, but also in steel, in construction, to actually develop a business model for Bangladesh exporters of garments. And essentially, the government played a major role in that, and 3 or 4 big garment manufacturers adopted that model. And then there was a kind of imitation process that went down. So that you've had Bangladesh's economic development, it now has a per capita income higher than India. It has been driven on the one hand by an improvement in agricultural yields and labor absorption outside agriculture in rural Bangladesh. Okay? Both microcredit driven to a significant extent, and by the government-led manufacturing exports supporting industrialization. The question is whether Bangladesh is going to be able to sustain this industrialization and to sustain increases in agricultural productivity. That's an open question. There are many people working on Bangladesh who said it might not be sustainable. But as I said, if you want to make a transition out of the middle income trap, you have to do many more things. And Bangladesh will need to do that. But the answer to Manuel's question is simple. That's what they did. Okay. Now, the second question about, I have argued for a long time, for the past 25 years, beginning with my work on governing globalization, that there is a huge demographic deficit in the international economic architecture. In the United Nations, you might have one country, one vote, or even in the World Bank, in the WTO, you might have one country, one vote. But in the Bretton Woods institutions, is $1, one vote. Okay, so there is a huge demographic deficit. All these institutions were created at a time when Asia and the developing world were not relevant. They had no political significance. Other than Latin America, which got independence in the early 19th century, Asia was mostly under colonial rule. So was Africa. Now that world has changed. But Asia has not been able to influence either the existing institutions in terms of reducing their demographic deficit, whether it's at the UN, the Bretton Woods institutions, and the other specialist organizations of the UN system, largely because embedded history, the industrialized countries have controlled them. At the last time, not this time around, there were two candidates from the developing world for presidency of the World Bank. Okay, Jose Antonio Ocampo from Colombia and Ngozi from Nigeria. And Ngozi has now become Director General of the WTO. But it was interesting that, BRICS, China, Russia, and India were the first to desert the developing country candidates. They did not extend their support. They went with the US. Now, that's just one example. And BRICS has not quite, come of the development bank, the new development bank hasn't come of age. It has to differentiate itself from the World Bank, from the IMF. It has not been able to do so. And it has been really caught in its own sort of rivalries. In a sense, China has sought to control the new development bank much more. And increasingly, other countries worry about it. Brazil worries, India worries, Russia, less so now that they're together. But we have not worked together. We in Asia, we in the developing world have not worked together to create fairer rules. Even, we live in a world of very unequal rules. We need to create fairer rules in old institutions, existing institutions. We need to create new rules on macroeconomic coordination because international financial markets need some regulation. We need to create new rules on the movement of people across borders in a world of globalization. But I am convinced that unless the developing world acts together, that includes Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and particularly China and India, and to some extent Indonesia, but also Brazil, Mexico. These are the big influential countries. They have to act together. At this moment, I don't see it will change. I'm being honest. I think, Xi Jinping in China is pursuing a different path. It would seem that under his leadership, and although there is debate in China, there are differences. He wants to make China number one, or the other superpower. So he's in competition with the United States. Now, India and China also have tensions at their border. Okay, but I do believe that if both governments were rational, they would come to the conclusion that they have much more to gain from cooperation than from confrontation. Not just in how they might help reshape the world, but also amongst themselves. Alas, that doesn't look possible at this moment. And you also asked about the role of the United States. You see, look, the US is Europe is in absolute decline. The US is no longer dominant. And the US, beginning with Donald Trump, has been in a withdrawal syndrome, partly because people in the United States, there is no political constituency to fight wars outside. Okay? And therefore, there is this withdrawal, and therefore the dominance of the US is diminishing while the dominance of China is rising. But we are nowhere near a move from Pax Americana to Pax Sinica. No, the US will remain through 2050 and beyond a leading economy. China will be larger in GDP because of size, but at much lower levels of income. It'll be at the cutting edge of technology, research, and so on. But it will not be a unipolar world. I'm not sure that it could even be a bipolar world. At this moment, it looks as if China is competing for the space. But China is almost exhausted surplus labor. Its growth rates are beginning to slow. Unemployment levels are very high. It is possible that we may get a slowdown in that economic powerhouse. Okay, it has the usual sources of growth have run out, surplus labor. So they are now going to have to, like industrialized countries, rely more and more on productivity increase, on technological upgradation. So the future looks uncertain. I think the only way forward could be a multipolar world where the United States and China both recognize the reality that there will be at least 10, 12 other countries. I did not mention Iran, Brazil and Mexico and Latin America for sure, Nigeria possibly in Africa 50 years from now. You will certainly have all these countries. Iran could also be a player. China and India, setting aside rivalries, at the moment, it's just my dream. It's a kind of romantics idea. The states in China and India are not thinking about that. There is too much tension, too much antagonism. That's the nature of politics, yeah.
Yes. Okay. So now I will have the chance
Your
to
question.
ask my question. That's my question. I'm the chair. Okay. You mentioned the last slide. You mentioned that after you write your book, there was a pandemic and then a war, and so there's a lot of change in the world. I would like you to explore a bit of these changes, if they change somehow, or in what extent your conclusions on your developments. And something that I would like to mention, that India, as we saw here by your answer to Manolo's question, has kind of a lot of leverage from the US, because India is supposed to be the opponent of the China in Asia, at least in the US. Plans. I like to see that. I think that US has this idea to have India as the big enemy, or at least an opposition with China. So, and I think India is using this leverage to operate in this very complicated world with Russia and oil. So it's a really interesting position, a non-aligned country with a lot of trade relations and so.
Well, I mean, maybe I should come to that last. I could and answer your question, the big question first, and come to the second question later.
The big question is really related to that. Of course, yeah. I diverge. So the big question is the change that you might see after this the war of the influence of war, because war is not over yet, and the influence of war in the whole situation, and specifically the very interesting position that India is taking in this whole changing the world map or geopolitical world order.
Yeah. Okay. So it is the two questions are connected, but let me begin where you started and end where you ended. My book does at the end reflect, albeit briefly, on how the next 25 years might unfold in Asia. That book was published in 2019. It was written in 2018, or it was finished in early 2019. Now, in doing so, I consider the longer term implications of recent changes in global political economy, driven in part by national politics, which includes not only the rise of populist authoritarian regimes everywhere, but also includes the changing geopolitics of the world, the likely impact of profound technological changes on the horizon, the possible environmental consequences of rapid economic growth in Asia, and the response of leading industrialized countries to the erosion of their economic dominance and political hegemony. Okay, so I did discuss all of these briefly in the book, but I did not anticipate a pandemic and a war. You might call them black swan events. A coronavirus emerged from the wet markets of Wuhan in China, surfaced in different parts of the world in early 2020, and rapidly transformed into a global pandemic that has now persisted for more than 2 years, turning the world upside down. Now, the vaccination drive has restrained its spread and curbed its impact, but the virus is not gone. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in early 22 has accentuated problems, economic and political, confronting the world. The war might be localized, but the continuing conflict is creating global ripples. Okay. Now, the question, just as things were beginning to unfold out of the pandemic and the situation might have improved, you got the war. Okay. Now, the pandemic, we know, prompted repeated and prolonged lockdowns across the world, shut down academic activities, particularly in manufacturing and services, and led to a sharp contraction in output and employment across the board. And workers in informal employment without social protection were deprived of livelihoods. The impact on micro and small enterprises was devastating. At a macro level, there was a serious disruption of global production networks. Just-in-time production systems were paralyzed, and imported intermediates and components were no longer available. Now, this situation might have improved, but then you get the war. Now, that disrupts global supply chains, not in manufacturing, but in food and fuels. Russia and Ukraine together are an important source of supply of wheat, maize, and edible oils in the world market. About 15%, 1/6 of wheat and maize trade, and about 1/4 of edible oils. While Russia is a primary source of oil and natural gas. Now, the sharp increase in prices of food and fuels will hurt the development prospects of import-dependent countries, particularly the well-being of poor people. Okay? And the war has introduced increased uncertainty. It's making markets very nervous. Okay? Now, what has this meant? This sort of the two black swan events. What have they meant for what's happening to economic growth, say, in the world? Now, there was a worldwide contraction in 2020. Real GDP growth was negative everywhere. Okay. However, the contraction in Asia was the smallest, at less than 1%. Now, estimates of GDP growth in 2021 show recovery and growth in all country groups, among which Asia has the highest again, But this was because of the low base thing. 2020 was bad. If you look at the IMF's latest World Economic Outlook, they describe it as gloomy and uncertain. Yet, if you look at their projections for 22, 23, you find that real GDP growth in developing Asia is expected to be 5 to 6% per annum, much higher than every other country group in the world. Now, inevitably, the pandemics has led to a slowdown everywhere. But evidence available, Carlos, suggests that in terms of medium-term prospects, economic growth in Asia is most likely to be significantly higher than in industrialized countries and developing countries, including Latin America and Africa, so that its relative importance in the world economy will most probably continue to increase further. In that sense, the essential argument of the book does not change. Yet, the future of Asia in the world cannot simply be an extrapolation from the past, okay? Or more of the same. The pandemic and the war are not without their consequences for Asia. Now, in the national context, the pandemic claimed not only lives, but also lost livelihoods. Okay? Prolonged lockdowns shrank employment opportunities, placing a disproportionate burden on the poor. The war led to a sharp increase in prices of food and fuels, accelerating consumer price inflation everywhere, including Asia. Okay? Hurting poor and vulnerable households the most. Now, there is an obvious danger that some of the benefits from the massive reduction in absolute poverty across Asia could be partly reversed. Similarly, economic recovery at a different pace in different countries has often been slow and almost always K-shaped. Incomes of the rich rise rapidly, incomes of the poor do not or fall. That tends to lead to an increase in inequality. Now, in the international context, the pandemic and the war could well be the proverbial last straw on the back of globalization, which has been under stress for some time. You know, global supply chains are stockpiling inventories. Large international firms are contemplating relocating or dispensing with offshore production. As an insurance against shortages and disruption, everybody is reinventing business models. Governments worried about global risks are in search of national economic security or strategic autonomy to reduce dependence on the outside world. Now, this milieu provides a very sharp contrast with the 30 years in which Asia blossomed and grew to what it has become. Now, I mean, I'll respond in two parts. In the national context, given the present conjuncture, there is much that Asia can learn from itself. Analysis of past development experience shows that rapid economic growth did shape development outcomes. It brought about a significant reduction in absolute poverty, even if it led to a significant increase in economic inequality between people. Yet, poverty reduction would not have been possible without rapid growth. Now, the counterfactual is important. But if you reflect on the future, it suggests that development outcomes will determine whether economic growth is sustainable. Indeed, in the book, I've argued that rising economic inequalities and inadequate employment opportunities in Asia, unless addressed, will mount. This challenge will be social and political. And ultimately, economic growth can be sustained only if it eradicates poverty, reduces inequality, and creates employment opportunities. Okay? Now, in the changed global context, so Asia has to learn that growth, it's not only important to recover in terms of growth, it's also important to create employment that reverses the losses in poverty reduction and mitigates inequality, because otherwise growth will not sustain from the demand side. Now, in the changed global context, more of the same might be difficult for Asia. Okay, so the future will not be shaped by the past, but it will be shaped in part by how Asia responds to these challenges. If you go back to 1970, there was widespread pessimism about Asia. Okay, yet as the book shows, the past 50 years turned out to be so completely different from what was expected. Surely then, the present conjuncture, difficult as it might seem, should not lead to the conclusion that the future for Asia and the world is dark. On the whole, I think there's more reason for optimism than pessimism. If there is this turbulence ahead, it will not go unchallenged. And I would say that if Asia was able to do what it did starting 1970, this is a relatively minor blip on the radar screen. But economics is not astrology, Carlos. I might be wrong. But on the whole, I think the world is going to slow down. Asia is going to slow down. Poverty will increase. Inequality will rise further. This will slow growth down further. But people will have to find a way around it. Unless they do, then we could be in a long period of stagflation, no? Because prices are rising everywhere. Britain has it to double-digit inflation. Now, on the other part of your related question is really fascinating. I have no definitive answer. The geopolitics of the world has changed profoundly in the past 25 years. Okay, it is attributable first to the relative, though not absolute, decline of Europe. And the economic decline is associated with the political decline. This has been juxtaposed with a globalization of Islam, which is challenging Western hegemony. And at the same time, the United States, for reasons that are essentially political within the United States, and a consequence of its misadventures elsewhere in the world. But the one thing we learned from the 20th century is that big nations lose small wars. The Chinese belong to Vietnam too. So there is that withdrawal syndrome in the United States. Okay, and then you have a kind of a rise of Asia, in which China is dominant, in that rise. But the rise of Asia is not only about China. It's about other parts of Asia. It includes India too. And you have this India-China rivalry, which exists on its own, but it's being exacerbated by the way the world is unfolding. Now, India's responses in the UN to the Russia-Ukraine war were very muted, as the Chinese were, because it has to do with geopolitics. India depends on Russia for spare parts for its defense equipment. India depends on Russia for imports of oil. India has had a long-term relationship with Russia. India also sees that Russia could be a countervailing force vis-a-vis China for them. So it's a balancing act. Similarly, there's a balancing act with the US, because the US sees India as the countervailing force in Asia to combat the rise of China. India sees support from the US in economic terms or strategic terms, plus this whole formation of the new Quad. You have the US, Australia, Japan, India, which the Chinese are calling encirclement. So, you are going to get these great games in geopolitics. I have no definitive answer on how this might unfold, but I think what happens in the next US presidential election could be an important pointer to what will happen. I think Europe is not a major player now. And I think with the departure of Shinzo Abe from Japan, he may not have been prime minister, but he has a powerful influence on Japan. All of that is going to make some difference. But things will change in China too. Nothing is forever in politics. Although Mr. Xi Jinping may be renewed as the general secretary of the party and numero uno, there is discontent. There is dissent in China. But it's a bit like the 19th century, when you look at Europe and Asia, what was called the Great Game. It looks uncertain. I would be hesitant to give you a clear answer. I have listed what I see as trends. The relative, though not absolute, decline of Europe, the rise and the globalization of Islam, which is challenging Western hegemony, The United States is not in decline. The United States is now unwilling to globalization needs a hegemon, a political hegemon, a country that can provide the currency. The US is the only one. China cannot, not yet, at least. The US is in withdrawal syndrome, and you have a rise of China and India and Indonesia and the rest of Asia. So it is shifting the balance of economic and political power, but in very unpredictable ways, Carlos. I'm not sure I can give you a definitive answer. I would be pretending if I did.
No, it's the best answer. It's just to comment and to mention all those problems and make like the big picture and not taking like an answer, because an answer I think is impossible. Someone that gives an answer in this situation is probably wrong. So the best step is to analyze.
But I do analyze in the book, and it might interest you and others, on the relationship between how national politics is evolving. The point is the rise of the populist authoritarian regime. So Erdogan in Turkey, Modi in India, she is not elected, but he's a bit like that. Putin, Bolsonaro, the whole range of people, Boris Johnson, Orbán, France escaped by the skin of its teeth, basically. Macron just about made a comeback. You could have had the National Front. So the world is changing, and I think that is partly a consequence of markets and globalization. It gave prosperity to a few and exclusion for the many. And increasingly, political parties became almost like twins. So the Republicans and the Democrats, the Labor and the Conservatives, the Christian and Social Democrats, everybody converged to the middle, and those disaffected were mobilized by all these populist leaders I mentioned, who use democracy to come to power, but then they undermine the very democracy that brought them to power. And there is this rise everywhere. It is something we have to try and understand.
Yes. Well, we cannot have a best answer or presentation than you gave to us. Thank you very, very much. It's always very illuminating. It's a pity that you cannot be with us so we can continue the discussion personally. It would be great. So anyway.
Sometime in the not-distant future at another Celso Furtado Congress.
Yes. We hope in the 6th Congress you'll be here among us. I hope.
Okay.
I'll try to.
You're planning for what, 2024, the 6th Congress?
No, next year maybe.
Or 23. Okay.
Yes.
Well, I look forward to that.
We will look forward to.
If the world allows us to travel, it's.
Yes, thank you, Deepak. It was always a pleasure to listen to you.
Thank you,
to learn so much. Yeah. Okay, from your and of course I have to say, everybody, just go to the Oxford University Press and download Professor Deepak book. That we will learn a lot from his ideas, and he's a very knowledgeable person, as you. The people that didn't know him now know. So thank you very much, and thank you everybody. Obrigado a todos que estão assistindo a gente. Thank you everybody, and bye.
Bye. Thanks very much.